In my teenage years, I was always up for an adventure, especially one that involved late-night parties. Little did I know that one particular party would lead me into a nightmarish experience I would never forget. It was a chilly, moonless night when my friend, David, invited me to a party in an old, decrepit mansion on the outskirts of town. The mansion was notorious, rumored to be the site of strange and sinister gatherings. Most people avoided it like the plague, but David had always been drawn to the macabre, and he promised this party would be unlike any other. As I approached the mansion, its looming silhouette seemed to leer at me against the inky blackness of the night. The wind howled through the trees, and the eerie sound echoed the foreboding atmosphere that surrounded the mansion. Ivy crawled up its cracked walls, and shattered windows stared like empty eye sockets. Inside, the scene was surreal. The flickering candlelight cast strange, dancing shadows on the faces of the partygoers, all of whom wore elaborate masks. The air was thick with an unsettling tension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had entered some otherworldly dimension. I searched for David through the labyrinthine hallways of the mansion, but the layout seemed to defy logic. The corridors twisted and turned, leading me further into the heart of the mansion's darkness. It felt as though the mansion itself was conspiring to keep me trapped within its walls. As I ventured deeper into the mansion, my unease intensified. I stumbled upon a room that made my blood run cold. A group of people stood in a circle, their faces illuminated by candlelight, their eyes wide with anticipation. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their words sounding ancient and otherworldly. On the table before them lay a collection of bizarre objects, like a scene from a forbidden ritual. I backed away from the room, convinced that I had stumbled upon something sinister. But as I turned a corner, I witnessed a sight that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. In a candlelit chamber, cloaked figures encircled a grotesque altar. Upon it lay a creature, or what used to be one, its body twisted and deformed, its skin pallid and mottled. The figures chanted in unison, their voices rising in a terrifying crescendo as they conducted their dreadful ceremony. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the nightmarish scene before me. Dread settled like a stone in my stomach, and I realized I had found myself in the midst of a horrifying ritual. The malevolent energy in the room was suffocating, and I knew I had to escape. Just as I turned to flee, I heard my name whispered from the shadows. It was David, his voice trembling with fear. He beckoned me to join him at the altar, his eyes vacant, devoid of the warmth and familiarity I once knew. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to run. Then, I saw it, a grotesque mask discarded on the floor, revealing David's lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. Panic surged through me as I realized that the person beckoning me was not David, but a sinister imposter. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The cloaked figures turned their attention to me, their faces hidden by shadows. Without thinking, I turned and ran, the sound of their eerie chanting echoing in my ears as I fled through the mansion's ever-shifting corridors. As I burst out of the mansion and into the stormy night, rain soaked me to the bone, but I didn't stop running. I never saw David again, and I never spoke of the horrors I had witnessed in that accursed mansion. To this day, the memory of that party haunts me, a chilling reminder that there are places where darkness thrives, where the line between the living and the supernatural blurs, and where even the closest of friends can become vessels for unspeakable horrors. As weeks turned into months, I tried to put that dreadful night behind me, convincing myself that it had all been a macabre nightmare. But the nightmares persisted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the sinister figures from the mansion were still lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to reclaim what had escaped them. One fateful night, as the moon hung low in the sky, I awoke to the sound of whispered voices outside my window. I peered through the curtains and saw cloaked figures, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The air grew cold, and I could see my breath as I watched them draw nearer. I knew I had to escape once more, to flee from the relentless pursuit of darkness. I grabbed a small bag, stuffed it with essentials, and slipped out of my house, leaving behind the life I had known. For years, I wandered from place to place, always staying one step ahead of the malevolent forces that sought to claim me. I could never stay in one location for too long, always looking over my shoulder, always on the run. The nightmares continued, each night a twisted reenactment of that accursed party. I could hear the chanting, feel the presence of those cloaked figures closing in. The dread and paranoia never left me, a constant reminder that I could never truly escape the horrors I had witnessed. And now, as I sit in this dimly lit room, recounting my tale of terror, I can't help but wonder if they are still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when they can finish what they started. I live in fear, knowing that the darkness is never truly vanquished, and that the horrors of that night may one day return to claim me once and for all. In the annals of horror, some stories are too terrifying to tell, but I survived one such nightmare, and I feel compelled to recount it now, if only to rid myself of the lingering dread that has plagued me for years. It all began with an invitation from my childhood friend, Michael. We had shared countless adventures together and were inseparable during our formative years. However, as we grew older, Michael became increasingly secretive and distant, his once warm and inviting demeanor giving way to a cold, detached disposition. One fateful evening, I received a mysterious message from Michael, inviting me to a late-night party at his family's sprawling estate. The invitation was peculiar, as it bore no address, and only a vague mention of an old mansion nestled deep within the woods on the outskirts of town. My curiosity got the best of me, and despite a gnawing sense of unease, I decided to attend. As night descended, I embarked on the journey into the heart of the eerie forest. The moon cast an eerie pallor over the twisted branches and gnarled trees, creating sinister shadows that danced like phantoms in the moonlight. The path seemed to stretch on indefinitely, and I had no choice but to follow the faint echoes of distant laughter and music that reached my ears. Eventually, I stumbled upon an ancient mansion hidden amidst the encroaching woods. The sight of the mansion was unsettling, its architecture an amalgamation of Gothic and Victorian elements, as if it were a relic of a bygone era that had been abandoned to the ravages of time. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, revealing a scene that defied all reason and sanity. The grand ballroom of the mansion was illuminated by a sinister, flickering light that emanated from candles placed strategically throughout the room. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and the guests who filled the room wore masks that concealed their identities, their eyes gleaming with an unsettling malevolence. In the center of the room, a grotesque altar had been erected, adorned with symbols and sigils that I couldn't comprehend. Upon the altar lay Michael's girlfriend, Isabella, her body motionless and pale. She was dressed in a white gown that contrasted sharply with the macabre tableau that surrounded her. As I stood frozen in shock, I witnessed the arrival of Michael's family, cloaked in dark robes that billowed like shadows. Their faces bore expressions of fanaticism and devotion, and they began to chant in a language that sent shivers down my spine. The words were ancient and otherworldly, a blasphemous incantation that seemed to beckon forth the very forces of hell. It was then that I realized the true horror of the situation. Michael and his family, along with their neighbors who had gathered in the backyard, were performing a sinister ritual to summon a malevolent entity, Satan himself. And Isabella was to be the sacrificial offering, her innocent soul to be claimed by the darkest depths of the abyss. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched in helpless horror. But then, in the midst of the chaos, I locked eyes with Michael. His gaze bore a sinister knowing, a malevolent spark that told me I had been lured into this nightmare intentionally. As the ritual reached its crescendo, Isabella's screams pierced the air, and the very ground seemed to tremble with the awakening of an ancient evil. I knew that I had to escape, that I could not bear witness to such unspeakable horrors any longer. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I pushed my way through the crowd and fled from the mansion. The night air was cold and unforgiving, but I ran until I reached the edge of the woods and emerged into the moonlit clearing. Behind me, the mansion erupted into a blaze of otherworldly flames, a conflagration that defied the laws of nature. The unholy ritual had succeeded, and the darkness had claimed its prize. I had narrowly escaped the clutches of a nightmare that defied all reason and logic, but I knew that the terror would never truly leave me. Michael had betrayed me, and I had been marked by the malevolent forces that had been unleashed that night. In the years that followed, I lived as a haunted man, forever tormented by the knowledge of what I had witnessed. The scars of that night ran deep, and I could never forget the chilling realization that my childhood friend had willingly embraced the darkness. As for Michael, he vanished without a trace, leaving behind a legacy of unspeakable horror. To this day, I wonder if he had orchestrated the entire nightmare as a twisted act of betrayal, or if he too had become a pawn in a game far more sinister than any of us could have ever imagined. One thing is certain, some secrets are better left buried in the depths of the unknown, for once they are unleashed, they can never be contained again.